There was a man in Caesarea by the name of Cornelius, a centurion in what was called the Italian regiment. He was deeply a religious man who reverenced God, as did all his household. He made many charitable gifts to the people and was a real man of prayer. About 3 o'clock one afternoon, he saw perfectly clearly in a dream an angel of God coming into his room, approaching him and saying, "Cornelius." He started at the angel in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" The angel replied, "Your prayers and your deeds of charity have gone up to heaven and are remembered before God. Now send men to Joppa for a man called Simon, who is also known as Peter. He is staying as a guest with another Simon, a tanner, whose house is down by the sea." When the angel who had spoken to him had gone, Cornelius called out for 2 of his house servants and a devout soldier, who was one of his personal attendants. He told them the whole story and then sent them off to Joppa.
It worked. Oh, fantastic. This technology stuff is really scary. "300 years ago, 400 years ago now, a guy named George Fox was walking out in the fields and he heard a voice. Here's his report. "On a certain time, as I was walking in the fields, the Lord said to me, 'Your name is written in the Lamb's book, which was written before the foundation of the world.' And as the Lord spoke it, I believed and saw in it the new birth." Sometime later, he writes this: "As I walked toward the jail," he was going to visit some people who were in jail for their religious beliefs, not people who believed like he did. This was a period of great ferment in religion in England, and you could get in jail for lots of things. So he was going to visit these people who were in jail. "As he was walking, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, 'My love was always to you, and you are in my love. And I was ravished with the sense of the love of God, and greatly strengthened in my inner man.'" Wouldn't that be nice to have God talk to you and say, "You are in my love. You have always been in my love." And if accompanying those words was this wave of divine emotion that lifted you, wouldn't that be sweet? Yeah, it would be. George Fox, the guy who wrote these words, he heard from God a lot. And I want to use him as a springboard for talking about hearing God. Now I have to laugh. Somebody this week, they had seen the title and they said, "Hey, wait a minute, I want you to tell us how we tell when it's really God talking." And then they told me some story about somebody who thought it was God talking, and it was not God. I'm not going to do that. I am going to acknowledge that question, and I'm going to leave it alone. And part of the reason I'm going to do that is this. How many of you saw the people running around the park this morning? Did you see that? And how many of you thought, "Whoa, those people are getting healthy"? All right, let me ask you this. How many of you people thought, "Those people are killing themselves or damaging their knees"? Okay, so somebody did. All right. 1 out of 200. Okay, about 0.5%. I've learned in family gatherings, if my dad is present, not to say anything about running. Because if I say anything about running, which I like to do, my dad will always pop up and say, "Nah, Johnny, Running's bad for your knees. I've known your body wasn't made to do that. He's probably right. But I'm going to guess that if we looked at Americans as a whole, and we asked the question, what percent of these people would find their life bettered if they ran, versus the percent of people whose life would be made worse if they ran, I'm thinking we probably don't need to pay as much attention to the dangers of running as the dangers of not running. It is certainly possible for people to think they have heard from God and they have not. And maybe at some future sermon I will talk about that. But I think it is far more likely that we will fail to hear. We are far more likely to be deaf than to have overactive ears. So I want to encourage our hearing today. This guy, George Fox, he was crazy. If you read through his autobiography, you'd be going, man, that guy's strange. He was. He was strange. But here's what I would point. This guy heard God. And you and I go, well, how do you know it was from God? Here's why I would say it was from God. What is the consequence of George Fox's hearing? He went on to found the Quaker movement. And you look at the impact of that movement in our world, and I'm going, if it wasn't from God, it must have been from God's brother. Quakers were the first people to understand the phrase, all men are created equal, to apply not to males. In the Declaration of Independence, when it says all men are created equal, actually what that means is all white educated men with a fair amount of property. Now, we built on it and we broadened it, so I don't mean to mock that step but let's be honest. The early American founders did not understand that phrase, at least in practice. I don't care what the theory was. The practice was it was a very, very select group of humanity that they were intending to honor. Quakers understood that instinctively and from the beginning that all, male and female, high and mighty, lowly and nobodies, that they genuinely all had something of God in them. And they carried a dignity because of that. Quakers were probably the first people ever to imagine that a person on trial had the same claim to respect and dignity as the judges and lawyers in the court. That is a radical vision. What? The person accused? Yes, that person still bears something of God, and every bit as much as the judge on the bench. Quakers led the way in the humane treatment of the mentally ill and criminals. You go down the line, Quakers were ahead of us in almost every significant moral, ethical question. They set the stage for what we dream of as Western movement. And every time they took a step in the right direction, everybody said, those people are crazy. And by one definition of crazy, that's correct. Sometimes when we call somebody crazy, we mean they see things a little different. Quakers saw things differently. And the entire world is better. And they saw things differently because following the teaching of George Fox, they had learned to listen for the voice of God. Now, in all these areas, the Quakers eventually got around to finding Bible texts that supported the exalted and advanced moral perspective that they took. But they did not get to those positions through study. They got there through listening. They learned how to study the Bible, not by using the scholarly apparatus, and there's certainly a place for that. I'm not putting it down. But I am saying it will not get you everywhere we need to go. And this we need to be crystal clear, that as the Quakers were moving forward, they were opposed at every step by Bible-thumping Christians, the Puritans, who thought it was good to torture criminals. After all, they need punishment. And it is still to this day in America, it is people who claim to be Bible-believing Christians who are the population segment most likely to approve of torture. The book is no protection against moral blindness if we are not cultivating a hearing. The Quakers opposed war. Did they get that out of the book? No. Can you find an opposition to war in the book? Yes, if you look for it. But if you're not looking for it, you can happily find all the justification for war you want. And conservative Christians, again, are more likely to approve of war as an instrument of foreign policy than any other population segment, because they think the book is all they need. The book is a powerful tool, but like every tool, it will be used the way your heart directs. It will not fix your heart unless you are looking for fixing. We need to learn to hear God. And if you look at the history of God's people, hearing is often what makes the difference. Our scripture reading, that's such a cool story. Thank you, Derek, for reading that. So there's this guy, this Roman officer, living over there in Palestine. He's a good man, it says. He prays, he's devout. Actually, the language is probably a technical term describing him as an almost Jewish person. He was not circumcised, he was not officially Jewish, but there were a lot of people in those days who had picked up the moral and even theological vision of Judaism and found that it spoke to their hearts, and they bought into it. And he refers to him as a God-fearing and devout man. That's probably what it's saying. He's doing the right thing. He's generous with his money. Apparently he's respected at home. He's a good guy. And then he hears the voice. Cornelius, I have a message from heaven for you. God's noticed what you're up to here. He's pleased. Now, got a job for you. Summon Peter from Joppa. Okay. So Cornelius summons Peter from Joppa. If you crawl into this story and you live with the characters, it'll put a smile on your face. Peter, he's the big guy in the Christian church, full of bombast, but he's Jewish. Completely Jewish. I tell people sometimes, I'm so Adventist that when I get cut, I bleed Adventist blood. Peter was so Jewish that it wasn't just he bled Jewish blood. He was Jewish. A Jewish follower of Jesus. But Jewish. So, these guys from Joppa these guys from Caesarea head down to Joppa to fetch Peter. Just before they get there, Peter is up on the roof, waiting for lunch, and he falls asleep. And he has a dream. And the sheet comes down and it's filled with all kinds of animals. And he hears a voice. Peter, get up, kill and eat. Peter must have been really hungry. But he wasn't that hungry. He was a good Jewish man. And that was not food. That was the wrong stuff in that sheet. We don't eat animals like that. Don't do that. Sheet goes away, it comes back. Peter, kill and eat. Wait a minute, I'm Jewish. That's not food. Happens again. Gets the message. Look, what I call clean, don't you call unclean. What's that mean? At this point in the story, the problem is you know the story, but if, what? Because God had called that stuff unclean. You know, at least the pictures that I saw in the books growing up, there were elephants and giraffes and pigs and probably a few vultures. I mean, that's what I've called clean, don't you call unclean. What? And then he says, look, there's somebody downstairs waiting for you. Go with them and don't ask questions. Can you imagine Peter going with somebody and not asking questions? It's the guys from Caesarea. Peter invites them to stay overnight. Already he's beginning to break some boundaries. He treats these people as welcome guests, and then he goes with them to be their welcome guest. And at that point, he has crossed a firm line of taboo. It was against the rules for Peter to go to Cornelius' house and not just go in the door, but to eat, to be the guest, to be at home in that house. No, 1,000 years of Bible study would have not gotten Peter to Caesarea. 2,000 years of Bible study. Some scholar trying to explain what Leviticus really meant, or the rules in Deuteronomy. What they really meant, Peter can't hear you. Peter knew what Deuteronomy and Leviticus said, and his community had told him what it meant. The only way Peter would have gone from Joppa to Caesarea and stayed in Cornelius' house was because he heard a voice. And I think in this case, God knew Peter's resistance. He made sure that it wasn't just... So Peter heard a voice, and then he gets up to Caesarea, and the centurion says, well, let me tell you what I heard. And he has this validation, because what Peter was doing was so radical. I don't know that he would have had the guts to do it on the basis of... He would have figured, I don't know. I must have... Maybe I was so hungry I lost my mind there for a few minutes. I mean, he was doing something radical in terms of opening the vision of to whom the gospel applied. Peter goes to Cornelius' house because God said it was okay. Cornelius called Peter because God told him to, and they got together and they said, this must be a divine appointment. Okay, so what are we here for? And Peter says, I'm not supposed to be here. And then Peter tells them the story of Jesus. And he has this little line in there. He says, and now I know that God is no respecter of persons in the King James language. That when God reads the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, God substitutes humans for man. And then he understands that humans are all of us. And we can know that not from the book alone, but only as we learn to hear what God is saying. In the Old Testament reading that we had, there's a point there that I think is really important for us to hear. God appears to Mrs. Manoah to tell her about what's going to happen. She goes home and tells husband, and the husband says, "Whoa!" And then he prays that the angel will come back. And the angel does come back. And you remember it says, angel came back not to Manoah, to Mrs. Manoah. Mrs. Manoah runs and gets Mr. Manoah. Then the angel talks to them. We do not all hear equally well. Now, the way we would ordinarily take a sermon that makes that statement and then say, and shame on those of you who don't hear as well. I'm not going there, and that's the wrong place to go. It would be like Wanda saying to me, shame on you for talking instead of singing. There's a reason why I talk instead of sing. The hearing, where there's dramatic turning points among the people of God, typically those who hear, it's not just anybody and it's not just everybody. There are people who have greater gifts for this. George Fox was not an ordinary person. Oh, if he can do it, you can do it. No. And even among the Quakers, he was different. Mrs. Manoah apparently had a gift that Mr. Manoah did not. And God spoke to Mr. Manoah through Mrs. Manoah. What was said needed to be heard by both. But it began with one. The Quakers have stirred our conscience. They hear in a special way. Their community has some special gifts of hearing in some of these ethical areas. And they have led a lot of Christians, a lot of society forward. We don't all hear equally well, and that's okay. But this I want to say to all of us. If you have the gift of hearing, let us know what you hear, if it is sweet and good, if it is wise. And if we do not have the gift of hearing the Almighty, which is okay, let's make sure we hear one another. The reality is, if someone claims that they hear the voice of God and they bring it to the community's job is not to merely say yes. We then have to process and analyze and say, is this really from God? But let's make sure we ask that question. Let's not just go, oh, well, whatever. This church has extraordinary gifts and resources. What is God calling us to do? What special work can we do, given the gifts and resources we have, given our privileges? We could sit down and develop strategic plans and have focus groups and all of that, and there's a place for that. But I'm wondering if there are people here who are hearing from God. I know some of you have the gift. You tell me about it. And I believe that if God whispers to you sweet things, He has a bigger plan in mind than, well, I'll say it, than merely consoling you. Now that's big and that's nice. But if God ravishes your heart with His love the way He did George Fox, what is the fruit of that? Can you bring it to us? Can you help us see what special thing we can do to cooperate with the work that God is doing in His world? The Christian church would still be a small Mideast sect, except for the fact that Peter and Cornelius listened and heard from God. We today condemn slavery, condemn torture, condemn war, repudiate the treatment of the mentally ill as criminals. Those visions are only possible because George Fox and his community listened and heard and then spoke and awakened the conscience of the world. So again, I just ask you, what are you hearing? Has God said something to you? Or if you have the gift of hearing, have you invited him to speak to you in a way that would touch more of us, calling us to greater, higher service, to a sharper, keener conscience, to a warmer, richer compassion? God speaks. Let's listen.